During a nocturnal hike in Providence, Rhode Island, a poor and unknown author named H.P. Lovecraft suddenly found his mind transported through time and space to a Yemen 1,000 years earlier. Here he was the famous poet Abdul al-Hazred, and his nasal, squeaky voice now rang golden and clear. He was one of the Caliph's most popular entertainers, but still he knew his place. He was not a part of the family, or even of noble birth. This had not previously been a problem for al-Hazred until the day his eyes met the eyes of the Caliph's daughter Sarah. Now, al-Hazred only had a single thought which occupied his waking hours and turned his nights into sleepless despair. So al-Hazred prayed to God without response, and finally, hardly noticing it, his mind slipped onto shadowy paths and the skies darkened. He had been heard. It became difficult to breathe, and a cloudy mass floated through the air as if he was immersed in a deep lake during algae blooms. Then he saw him. He appeared out of a corner in the room. Black beard, bright blue eyes, and a chalk-white face that was frozen and unreal as a mask. Al-Hazred's eyes watered, his ears popped. He felt an abysmal horror of this thing, apparently only disguised as a man, who now spoke to him. "I am Nyarlathotep. Be my voice, and I will help you." Nyarlathotep pointed to a small wooden box on the floor, while his body faded away until only his stiff, white face hung suspended in the night air. Al-Hazred sensed catastrophic consequences, but yet found himself immediately opening the box. Out of the darkness of the box crept a strange little insect. Al-Hazred gasped in surprise, but before he could react, the insect flew straight into his mouth and down his throat. He coughed, vomited, but to his horror, he felt the insect becoming entrenched in his vocal cords and injecting a poison that made his blood boil to a fever. Inside his throat began a metamorphosis, and the insect merged with his vocal cords and formed an entirely new organ. Al-Hazred tried to scream, but instead of a scream, now came the insect's song, the clearest and most beautiful tone he had ever heard. Afterwards, the tone was still hanging in the air, and he could see that it had adopted a physical form of a golden glow. All the flies in the room flew drowsily, enchanted through the golden sea. That same evening, Al-Hazred had a poetry reading in the Caliph's banquet hall. As soon as Al-Hazred opened his mouth, the insect song rang out, and everyone in the room got stuck in a golden hypnosis. All but the Caliph's daughter Sarah. There they were now, in a golden sea of bewitched people, and for the first time, they could talk in private. That evening was the beginning of their secret romance. It lasted for several months until their happiness came to an end. Sarah was noticeably pregnant. The Caliph was furious. It was not long before he had gotten his daughter to tell. The rumors of Al-Hazred as a magician had for some time spread, and therefore he was captured in his sleep and imprisoned with a gag in order not to enchant anyone with his voice. Shortly thereafter, they cut out his tongue and his genitals. For 9 months, Al-Hazred was tortured in the Caliph's dungeons. He fought bravely until the Caliph revealed what it was Al-Hazred had been fed in his dungeon the last 3 days, and held up the mangled remains of his newborn son. Finally, Al-Hazred screamed out, a muted, muffled cry of the soul. The small insect was hiding in his throat, waiting, waiting. Al-Hazred was alone, and it almost felt like a relief when they finally cut out his eyes, and his world fell into darkness. Al-Hazred's dismembered body was thrown into the desert. Then the small insect crawled forth and grew Al-Hazred a new tongue to talk to him through his own mouth. Master Nyarlathotep is impressed by your perseverance. He wants to give you a chance to regain what you have lost. His eyes were gone, But in his mind's eye, Alhazred now saw the outlines of a huge, ancient city, with architecture of almost extraterrestrially strange geometry take shape in front of him. This could not be anything but the nameless city he had heard of in legends. Alhazred staggered away from the murderous sun, through the gates, and down a flight of steps, deep into the earth. Guided like a bat by the insect's impulsive vocal shrieks, his fingers slid over wicked inscriptions in the stone walls, whose magic formulas he dare not speak aloud. Finally, he reached the bottom. His hands touched slippery ropes that hung from the ceiling. "Hold out your palms," commanded the insect. Alhazred did so, and in his hands landed 2 rubies. "This will be your eyes from now on." Alhazred brought the rubies to his empty eye sockets, and suddenly he could see. He saw. The ceiling above him was an udder of a huge beast, venomous snakes. 2 snakes bit around his eye sockets and sealed the rubies in place with their poison. He felt one of the snakes detach itself and wriggle inside his shirt and down towards his crotch, where it became entrenched. The snake bites barely hurt, but the horror of the situation caused him to rush in panic up the stairs, out of the nameless city, and into the desert. Alhazred's sight now had a filter of the red rubies, which added a layer of hell to reality. Night had arrived, and the moon sent a thin pillar of light down into the blackness of the desert. In the middle of it stood Nyarlathotep, with his pale facial mask held in his hand. His real face was dark as night, with eyes like glittering stars and a smiling mouth full of sharp teeth. "Abdul Alhazred, I have given thee sight, voice, and genitals once more," said Nyarlathotep. "The only thing I want back is my love. You said you'd give me back everything." Nyarlathotep opened his murderous mouth like a shark. "And I always keep my word. But then you need to keep yours and be my voice here among the people and spread my words." Without hesitation, Alhazred agreed, and the very next moment landed a huge winged beast made of the rotting flesh of 100 camels. The stench was intense, but Alhazred took his place on the back next to the Dark Master. Up into the night sky they went, higher and higher, and sometimes it seemed as if they were traveling through space and other dimensions. Eventually there appeared a tower in front of them in the night, and in it was a window that Alhazred found himself entering. It led into his beloved's chamber. With a jump, Sarah stood out of bed. Alhazred rushed over to her with soothing words, telling her that it was only him and that everything would be fine. But what came out of his mouth was something else. Grotesque, aggressive, threatening sentences grunted from the throat of a beast. Sarah screamed in panic and jumped out of the window to escape over to a neighboring rooftop, but lost her footing. She fell to her death on the stone-paved terrace below. In shock, Alhazred staggered backwards, and his eyes fell on a mirror across the room. He saw. His eyes were hellish rubies, melted solidly in his eye sockets, and out of the crotch of his pants wriggled a speckled serpent's tail. Out of his mouth crawled a tongue, looking more like a centipede. The rest of the night, Alhazred screamed and cried. The sounds that came out of his throat were so horrific that the old people in the city prayed to God and whispered, "Al-Azif, Al-Azif," the nocturnal sounds of insects and the howling of jinn. After this, Alhazred fled to Damascus. There he began writing Al-Azif, a scripture with the sole purpose of warning mankind of Nyarlathotep. He wrote in a fever-filled frenzy, and when he finished and read through what he had written, he got a shock. What had ended up on paper was not what he intended. The writing was a scripture that would drive the reader to madness and summon cosmic horrors to wipe out humanity. Nyarlathotep had taken control of his pen. He had been tricked once more. The mad god Nyarlathotep danced an insane dance here on Earth, while his real guys, Azathoth, wallowed bubbling beyond the universe, ready to gush forth and obliterate everything in its path as soon as the stars were in the right formation. Alhazred had reached his limit. He raised a knife to end his life, but grotesque creatures appeared out of the walls of his room. He ran out of his house and straight into a crowded marketplace outside, where he, in front of 50 horrified witnesses, was torn to pieces and devoured by an invisible monster. More than 2 centuries later, Alhazred's scripture, the Alasif, was translated into Greek and later Latin. It was given the name Necronomicon. After H.P. Lovecraft recovered from this traumatic astral travel through time and space, he tried for 15 years to convey the dangers of Nyarlathotep through his stories. Finally, on his deathbed, he wrote down all of Alhazred's writing from memory into what he called his death diary and bequeathed it to his friend Robert Barlow. After Lovecraft's death, Barlow took the book to Mexico, where he eventually committed suicide. The book is, as of today, still missing.